All right, we shall call this meeting to order. Hope everybody had a good weekend. I just got a couple announcements. First of all, the highway cleanup Saturday, May 4th from Drum to Rosedale, so please be aware and safe, and please do not throw litter out the window, so these young kids that are walking along the roads shouldn't have to be picking up our garbage, so let's try to stop littering. Springfest is going on. East Cooley Springfest is Friday, Saturday. Please go out and support them. They do a lot of work for the community, and they've got some incredible talent coming, so check that out. And spring cleanup started today, and that's just a reminder that demolition material is not accepted. So please be sure that you're not putting demolition material in the piles, because it will not be picked up. So before we get going, I need to read a proclamation. The proclamation is Emergency Preparedness Week, May 5th to May 11th, whereas Emergency Preparedness Week is a designated week aimed at increasing awareness to help Canadians take action to protect themselves and their families during emergencies. Canadians are asked to take 3 simple steps to become better prepared to face a range of emergencies, know the risks, make a plan, and get an emergency kit. Whereas working in partnership with each other, all orders of government, first responders, private industry, and non-governmental organizations, we are building a more resilient and safer Canada. Therefore, I hereby, Mayor Heather Colberg of the town of Drumheller, proclaim May 5th to 11th, 2019 as an Emergency Preparedness Week. And as we're seeing what's going on the other side of Canada, it's definitely something we all got to be preparing ourselves for. So that's our thoughts with all those people going through this terrible time right now. I listened to a CBC program on it yesterday, and it was quite informative, and I think we're ahead of the game on a lot of the stuff. So well done, administration. So can I get a motion to adopt the agenda? Tom, seconder, Tony. Any additions or deletions? All in favor? Carried. Motion to adopt the regular council minutes of April 15th. Jay, Christine, all in favor? Carried. Attached, you'll find the minutes of the Municipal Planning Commission meeting of March 14th and 28th. And now I don't see. Oh, our delegation is running a bit late. So let's move on then. We'll keep moving, and let's go on to 6.1.1, Daryl.
I'm going to hand this over to Greg.
Thank you. Believe a second and third reading of Community Standards Bylaw 0619. Before anything further,
Actually, Greg, it's my error. Can I get a motion for second reading of bylaw 06.19? Tony, second. Fred, comments? Go ahead, Greg. Thank you.
Ms. Colbert, if pleases council, on page 24, there is a definition of derelict vehicle near the second from the top of the page. Because of issues, disputes, understanding, and our attempt to educate and inform part of the public, I would like to add, in accordance with the sections 3.05 and 3.06 that deal with derelict vehicles, a definition of a vehicle in the bylaw. This is identical to what is in the Provincial Traffic Safety Act, and it would offer a broader interpretation of plain and simple. A vehicle means a device in, on, or by which a person or a thing may be transported or drawn on a highway. It includes a combination of vehicles, but does not include a mobility aid. That is the strict provincial wording under the Traffic Safety Act, and it would allow, in our efforts to clean up derelict equipment and derelict vehicles, it would allow enforcement staff no dispute when it came to matters such as trailers, such as abandoned wheeled vehicles, things that, and again, not to be overwhelming in our authority, but to be able to use the authority properly in an effort to clean it up without getting into a a dispute where someone feels that what is in their yard, although rotting and decaying, is somewhat decorative or somewhat of a useful vehicle. So the draft that you have in your package does not include that. The separate sheet, that is how it would look on page 26. If this change was allowed to go into the draft, it would appear after unsightly premise but before violation ticket. And as I said, this is not made up. This is the provincial definition of a vehicle.
Can you reread that, Greg, please?
Vehicle means a device in, on, or by which a person or a thing may be transported or drawn on a highway, and includes a combination of vehicles but does not include a mobility aid. The mobility aid reference is to allow leeway, of course, for disabled people who may traverse a highway in their effort to get somewhere on the powered aid that they're using. That rarely would only come into play with us as if we had abandoned derelict mobility aids, and it wouldn't even be an issue for municipal enforcement. I'm just seeking to add a definition of vehicle so it clarifies what exactly a derelict vehicle is in the course of our enforcement duties.
Okay, any other amendments before we recall the motion? I'd like to bring up item 3.23. So I still, after listening to some people at the open house, this broken window or door opening, it should be repaired within a reasonable time period. Is it possible to change that to, and I agree that there's complexity of windows. However, if we say within 30 days or discretion of the CAO, that way if there is a complex window and they show Daryl that they're trying to get it resolved, Daryl has that ability to override that discretionary. It just came up 3 or 4 times in talking to people since that meeting and since it's been announced. So any comments on that? Jay?
If I'm understanding it correctly, Your Worship, the issue is, of course, the previous version of this bylaw included an actual time frame, a number of days. And what's been removed is that number of days, because what may be reasonable in one case is 7 days, and what may be reasonable in another case is 65 days. And so by removing the days reference altogether, the intent was actually to allow for greater discretion. I'm only, the only confusion that I've heard has been at that open house as well. And it seemed to be not based on an understanding of the fact that the new bylaw will have greater flexibility in that it doesn't attach a timeline in days, rather than that was the intent, was not to provide more discretion for bylaw to require people to do things in less time, but on the contrary, to allow them to use their good judgment to apply whatever appropriate timeline fits each and every situation with which they're addressed. So putting in 7 days would then, of course, cause a great deal of confusion and consternation because, of course, people would then leap that that's what they're going to have to do and not reach to the second part of the paragraph saying, or what's deemed discretionary. So I'm comfortable with the wording as it is because it's taken out something that was constrictive and now is far more flexible by the use of the phrase reasonable time period. And I guess our ability to communicate to the public that's what we're talking about rather than cracking down more has been lacking if we're still not getting through, because that's the whole point of this. Am I not right? Yeah.
Tom?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we could define it a little more. Like reasonable, of course, is so subjective. So what is reasonable to you is not reasonable to me. So I'm just wondering if we could put in there reasonable as defined by or as determined by the bylaw officer or as determined by the CAO or something like that. Because that was the question that we had at the think, well, what is reasonable? I mean, that's reasonable, or that's reasonable, or, so reasonable as determined by the CAO or something like that would define it maybe a little bit more.
Anybody else?
Again, I have to say, guys, that coming from the law enforcement background that Greg does, the reasonable person test is applied to the vast majority of things where discretion's involved, and it is meant to be based on experience, and I think because we're talking about a bylaw, again, perhaps it's too implied, but of course it's reasonable to the person enforcing the law. That I'm not sure why that has to be said in any more detail, but if anyone thinks that their interpretation of reasonable is binding per the law, then I guess we would have it written poorly. But I don't know how a reasonable person could look at that and think, well, if I think it's reasonable that it should take me 64 days, but they think it's reasonable that it should take me 14. I guess what I want is what works. I have a hard time believing that's what a reasonable person would think. Greg, you want to help me out here?
Mr. Garbett, in addition to what it says, we also investigate to determine further circumstances around each case of vandalism, broken material, damaged window. And this additional investigation and evidence we may find further adds to what Mr. Garber referred to as the standard of the reasonable man. Again, to say what is reasonable for one person may not be reasonable for another. We're talking about a preponderance of data and evidence that we based on what is reasonable. And I think if you start trying to define reasonable, with all due respect, you defeat the purpose of the term reasonable. And I really believe ultimately the end result, should be left to the totality of circumstances and evidence that we find that determines, in this case, this is what is reasonable.
Anybody else?
Just actually, what if you said, or what if we said that at the reasonable time period, as defined or as determined by the CAO or by the bylaw office or something, so that there is still a bit of ultimately that's the defining party, is the person that says, yes, I agree that your interpretation of 64 days to get a window replaced might be your idea, but I know I can get this window in 10, so I'm going to say that that's the right number. So I think that if we want to clear that up a bit, that's the only suggestion I have. Just because then you're taking away who's determining what's reasonable.
Okay, and my point for bringing this up is, I guess the bottom line is the bylaw gets followed, because it's, we just have too many buildings here with plywood and broken windows, and so we've been more than reasonable. And so all I'm saying is, if we're going to have something in here, whatever reasonable is to you, I guess isn't the same reasonable to me or others. So if we want to roll with this and see how it goes, then that's what we shall do. So I'll leave that in your hands, Greg. So can I get you to amend your motion? Fred, I believe or Tony made the motion to add the vehicle description of the vehicle, derelict vehicle, into the community standards?
Also amend the motion to include the definition of vehicle.
Your mic.
Also amend the motion to include the definition of vehicle as stated.
Okay, Jay?
Councillor Zarisky did bring it up, and it was seconded by the CAO as far as his opinion goes. So I have no issue with further amending 3.23 that within a reasonable time period, as determined by the CAO, be the words added to that sentence. I have no issue there.
I like it.
Yeah.
All in favor? Carried. Can I get a motion for third reading? Tom, Fred, comments? All in favor? Carried. Good discussion. All right. Are we ready? Okay, we'll move back to 5.1, presentation of 2018 audited financial statements. Well, while he's setting up, let's just do one more here. Let's do 6.1.2. It's just a motion for first reading, so can I get a motion?
Yep.
Jay?
I will move first reading of bylaw 8.19.
Seconder, Christine? All in favor? Carried. All right, now we'll give you a minute. All right, Leon, welcome, and we will let you take over. It's all yours.
Got it? Got the red light? All right, thank you. So you should have hopefully two documents in front of you. One is our formal report to council, which is more of a, I refer to it as an audit findings memo, and then obviously we've got your financial statements. I didn't bring a copy of the FIR, but as you know, that is just a formatted presentation of your financial statements that goes to Alberta Municipal Affairs, so they can obviously drive all of their statistics, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'd like to do is go through the financial statements first. I'm going to go through them fairly high level. I know Daryl and Barb do a pretty good job of keeping you guys up to speed on sort of how the town is doing in terms of its surplus and things of that nature. So I'm going to keep it fairly high level, and then if anybody has any questions, I'm glad to answer any of those. And then we'll spend a few minutes in the formal report to council, if that's okay. Okay. If I can get you to turn to just after the management's responsibility for financial reporting, the page that has the RSM letterhead on it. That is our auditor's report for 2018. If you compare this auditor's report to last year's, you'll notice it's roughly about double in size. Basically, what's happened to the auditor's report is they've made it explicit in there who's responsible for what in terms of the financial statements. So you'll see a section on the auditor's responsibility for the audit of the financial statements, and then you'll see a section on the responsibilities of management. So they just didn't want there to be any guesswork in terms of who's responsible for what. So that's a change that you'll see in any audit report that you pick up, whether it be for municipal entities or for-profit entities or public companies. This is a new format of the audit report. The important thing to focus in on, again, is the basis for opinion, and our opinion itself. So that's a clean audit opinion, as I'm sure you were expecting. So no reservations or qualifications in the audit report. And obviously, these statements are prepared in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but obviously they'll look fairly familiar to you, as there haven't been any changes in presentation with respect to Canadian public sector accounting standards. There's one little small other matter paragraph you'll see right in the middle of the first page there. That's just indicating that even though I'm the same audit partner and our firm is substantially the same audit firm, we went through a merger and a name change, so I have to make it specific in there that your financial statements were audited by another firm of Canadian chartered accountants. So that is a small addition to your financial statements in your audit report. So again, a clean audit opinion. The date on the audit report is slightly different. It used to be the date the financial statements were approved by council. This may change slightly by a day or so. It's now the date that our firm signs off on the file quality review. And so that process was more or less completed today, so we just need a signature. It's probably going to happen in the next 24 hours. So this date may change by maybe one day. Probably April 30th is going to be the date of your audit report. Excuse me. Page 4 is your statement of financial position, or your balance sheet. Again, no changes in the format. Public sector accounting standards, of course, use the financial assets, liabilities, net financial assets, and non-financial assets format. That's obviously different. Probably if any of you own a business and do financial statements, you'll notice that's not how those financial statements are presented. They're presented current liabilities, long-term liabilities, retained earnings. These are obviously slightly different. Just in terms of your financial assets, the one thing I would focus on there is obviously your cash and cash equivalents is down, but that's more or less balanced off by a significant increase in investments, and that's just a difference in investment strategy, and you had some excess funding that you put away for when you're going to spend that money. So that's the biggest change you'll see to your financial assets. They're up about 3.2 million over the previous year. Otherwise, accounts receivable down again. You'll see they're about 5.3 million. That the collecting of those receivables did make somewhat of a contribution to that investment balance as well. So anytime you're collecting AR, your cash is going up, and part of that balance is trapped in that 25.6 million of investments. On the liability side of the balance sheet, you're pretty much comparable to prior year. You're up about maybe 400,000. Again, if you look at everything on a line-for-line basis, it's very comparable. Deferred revenue up a bit, and then obviously your long-term debt came down during the year as you're paying that off, making the scheduled repayments. So liability-wise, you're very comparable to the prior year. You end up with net financial assets, an increase of about 2.7 million, up from 10.6 million to 13.3 million. So anytime that net financial asset line is getting bigger, that's a good trend. So that's trending in the right direction, and obviously is better than a net financial debt position, which you're far from. Although if you pick up enough municipal financial statements, you'll find a few of those. So, non-financial assets, Again, this is where the bulk of your assets are tied up, and that's obviously in your tangible capital assets. That's very common with municipalities and cities. Your tangible capital assets, they're up slightly over the prior year. They're sitting at just over $142,200,000. You have a little bit of inventory for consumption, and I say little compared to the rest of your capital assets, and that's just some gravel and fuel and things like that that basically gets consumed on a fairly slow basis. This isn't inventory that's turning over on a yearly basis by any means. And then you've got a little bit of prepaid expenses. So you end up with non-financial assets of $143,115,000, and then you end up with an accumulated surplus of $156,446,080. So again, up about $3 million overall from the prior year. The next statement on page 5 is your statement of operations, or your statement of profit and loss, if you want to call it. Most of that in sales and user fees, and then your net municipal taxes were up a bit. Otherwise, a little bit more of investment income, which we would expect to see by putting more money into interest-bearing investments. So your overall revenue is up about $600,000 compared to the prior year. On the expense side, you're actually down about $800,000. Administration was up a bit, about $40,000, but the biggest decrease was in protective services. You're down about $490,000 in the protective services, down a little bit in transportation services, and then you're also down in water and wastewater, about $300 on that line. Otherwise, again, fairly comparable year over year. So that expense line is staying fairly consistent. So you end up with actually an excess this year of revenues over expenses before your capital revenues of just over $1 million. Compare that to the prior year loss of $325. That's about a $1.3 million swing. So obviously that's, again, a positive direction. And considering you budgeted for approximately an operating loss of about $845, so you beat budget by almost $1.9 million. On the capital revenue side, government transfers for capital are down a bit, about $800,000, and then other capital revenues and your gain on disposal of tangible capital assets, again, are fairly comparable. Those are small numbers overall. So you can see your government transfer line, when you compare it to budget, it's quite a bit below budget, but I understand you did some significant budgeting for for grants with respect to flood mitigation. I think you had some fire equipment, some other capital structures in there that you had budgeted to purchase. Obviously, when that doesn't happen, you don't take those government revenues into income. So you end up with an excess of revenues over expenses for the year of just over $3 million, again compared to $2,445,000 in the prior year. So that's a healthy swing of almost $600,000. The next statement on page 6, and we'll get this corrected for you. It's supposed to print out landscape, but this basically shows your accumulated surplus is basically divided up into 3 pots, if you will. Your unrestricted surplus went from $5.7 million down to about $4.6 million. That $4.6 million basically represents the funds of the town that can be used for any purpose, hence the unrestricted title. Then you do have your restricted surplus of $18.8 million. That's up about $3.3 million, and these are basically all the reserves that the town has set up, and there's a list of those further on in the financial statements. Again, these are monies that are internally restricted, not subject to any sort of external restrictions. So that's an important distinction to make. And then obviously your largest portion of your accumulated surplus is your equity and your tangible capital assets, and that basically represents the net book value of all of your capital assets. So the original cost less the accumulated depreciation to date minus any debt that you have against those assets. So you end up with just over 133 million in equity and tangible capital assets, for again a total of 156, 446, 80, which will tie back to your balance sheet. Page 7 is your consolidated statement of changes in net financial assets. This is just, if you go back to your balance sheet or your statement of financial position, this was the number that was right in the middle of that statement. It's basically your it's your financial assets minus your liabilities. Just shows how those balances are basically affected. Obviously, it starts with your annual surplus, and then you make adjustments for things like acquisition and amortization of tangible capital assets, and some adjustments in your inventory and prepaids. And again, I mentioned before, your net financial asset balance went up about 2.7 million. That's an important trend. So you end up again with a higher net financial asset balance than you did at the beginning of the prior year. Page 8 is your consolidated statement of cash flows. This basically is the statement in your financials that converts everything that's going on in your statement of operations and your balance sheet into cash flows. So at the top, the top half of this statement of cash flow basically represents your cash flow from operations. So as you can see there, about halfway down the page, you end up with a positive cash flow from operations of 13,856,773. That's up quite a bit from the prior year, but the important thing is that that balance is positive. Basically says that the core operations of the town are generating positive cash flow. If they're not, if the core operations of the town aren't generating positive cash flow, that means you'd either have to start borrowing to subsidize that, or you'd need grant funding to sustain operations. So that's an important reflection of obviously good management and various other factors. You do spend money on capital activities. That's just the nature of the beast. You spend about 4.6 million in acquiring tangible capital assets, and again, I would expect that to increase probably substantially over the next 2-3 years with the projected plans to flood mitigation and things like that. So I'm expecting that number to increase next year. Investing activities, again, it's shown as a cash outflow of 15 million, but that's simply because we took the money out of your cash and we invested it. So it shows up in the statement of cash flow as a cash outflow, but it really hasn't left the entity per se. It's just transformed into a different type of cash. And then obviously your financing activities. You did take on a bit of long-term debt, about 476,000. Obviously that supplements your cash flow, but more importantly, you repaid just under $900,000 of your long-term debt. So for a net cash outflow of about 414,000 for financing activities. So you end up with overall a decrease in cash of 6.4 million compared to a positive cash flow last year of 536. And again, important thing to note about that 6 million, most of that is tied up in the transition of cash to investments. So it's not all leaving the organization in terms of paying suppliers or building capital assets. Most of that is that, as you can see, is that $15.2 million that flowed into investments. So at the end of the year, obviously you went from 10.5 million in cash and cash equivalents down to 4.1 million. But again, you've got $25 million sitting in investments now, and that's where the bulk of that cash went. The rest of your financial statements are a series of notes and schedules. You didn't have any changes in accounting policies this year. You did have to adopt by default some new accounting policies due to changes in the public sector accounting standards, but they didn't have any impact on your disclosures or any of the balances in your financial statements. But it does say explicitly in note 1 that you've adopted them. They haven't had any impact. You have some more to adopt next year that may have an impact, and we can have some further discussions on that after as to what that might look like. So you'll have a few that we'll need to work through for next year. Page 14, notes 2, 3, and 4 are really just supplemental notes to your cash and cash equivalents, your taxes receivable, and your accounts receivable balances on the balance sheet. Again, you can see there your cash is made up of current accounts, and then there is a little bit sitting in some investment margin accounts. Your taxes receivable, again, you got your current taxes and grants in place, non-current taxes and grants in place make up about 1.3 million. And then you've got a relatively small allowance against those receivables. Again, there's bound to be some amounts that aren't collectible, but again, this is important thing to note is that that allowance is simply a management estimate, and if collections are better, obviously that size of allowance is not required. Accounts receivable, again, that's mostly trade receivables of 2.5 million, and you've got some government grants in there, and then again, a small allowance is allowed for potentially uncollectible amounts. Overall, those percentages are very small. Page 15, you do have some inventory held for resale, and most of that is land held for resale of about $1.8 million. That would be your cost. Obviously, we don't amortize that land, so about 1.8 million in land. Note 6 just breaks out the $25 million we talked about that you currently have in investments. Again, most of it's in short-term term deposits. Again, very secure, earning a reasonable rate of interest. And the important thing there is that the principal is 100% secure, so it's not invested in something that could lose value. Then you've got a little bit in long-term investments, and then fixed income notes and principal protected notes. Again, all very secure forms of investments. And then obviously you can see the terms attached to those short-term and long-term investments just below the table. Note 7 on page 16 is just a breakdown of your employee benefit obligation. Obviously, the town has some accrued vacation and long-term service benefits that it owes to its employees. And that's just a summary of that. Note 8, fairly important note. It's basically a continuity schedule of your deferred revenue. So the town obviously receives lots of grants and funding. And when it receives that funding, it sits on the balance sheet as a liability until the terms and conditions of the grant funding have been met, which typically means you've spent the money in the appropriate manner in which it was designated. Once that's done, you get to take all of that income into, basically all that grant money into revenue at that point. So that's that deferred revenue balance. As you can see, one of the biggest amounts. Well, you received about 3.5 million in new revenues, grant funding during the year, and you recognized about 2.5 of your overall revenue. So the balance didn't change much. Note 9 on page 17 is your long-term debt. Again, most of it is Alberta Capital Finance Authority debentures, which is the standard long-term debt for most municipal bodies. At the end of the year, your principal owing is just over 9.1 million, and then you can see the repayments that you'll make over the next 10 to 15 years. The first 5 years are disclosed there, and then as you can see, there's a lump sum after that. But that'll get, as you get beyond 2023, then we'll continue to show that in 5-year blocks. So that's not a balloon payment after the year 2023, just so you know. So you're paying about, by the time the loan is extinguished, you'll pay about 4.1 million in interest on a $9.2 million loan. And during the year, your interest amounted to about $410,000 on that. Note 10 on page 18 is just a breakdown of your tangible capital assets. Again, shows you the cost of those assets, the accumulated amortization to date by category, and then the net book value. Again, the important thing to note here is that net book value does not represent fair market value. So in some of these instances, in the case of land and land improvements, the fair market value might be considerably higher than the net book value. For all the other assets that are being depreciated, one would estimate that the net book value probably approximates fair market value, but it's not an exact science. Again, the amortization rates you use are just estimates, and those change from time to time depending on if the state of the asset changes or something to that effect. So that's your tangible capital assets for the year. Note 11, we talked about your net investment or equity in tangible capital assets. Again, you can see the 238 million is your cost, the 96.1 million is your accumulated amortization, and then you subtract the debt that you have borrowed against those assets to come up with your net investment or equity in your tangible capital assets of 133 million. A few pages ago, we had the statement of changes in accumulated surplus, and we talked about the 3 pots you had, the unrestricted, the restricted, and the investment in intangible capital assets. This basically shows the breakdown of those restricted surplus. So you can see the number of reserves that the town has and what's sitting in each of those reserves and the change in those reserves year over year. And again, important thing to note is reserves are very much estimates, and depending on the facts associated with those reserves, those can go up and down year over year. Note 13 and 14 on page 20. Note 13 is your net municipal taxes. Basically just shows where you're collecting the bulk of your revenues from a tax perspective. Obviously, most of it's made up of real property, and you've got a little bit of some linear property taxes and some special assessments for 12 million gross, and then as part of those taxes, you are collecting some fees on behalf of the Alberta School Foundation and the Sunshine Seniors Lodge. So obviously those come out at the end of the day from your revenues, and 8.75 million is approximately what you took in for the year. Note 14 is just a breakdown of your government transfers. That should tie back to your statement of financial position in terms of capital revenues. Again, we show operating revenues of just over 900,000, and then capital transfers of just under 1.9 million for a total of 2.8 million. Page 21, note 15, it's just a breakdown of your expenses by object. So it's just a different presentation of your financial statements or of your expenses. Not sure which one of those presentations resonates the best with the folks in the room, but this is just breaking those expenses down into slightly different categories. Obviously, some of your employees are members of the local authority's pension plan, so we're required to disclose what that looks like. I think we understand how that works. Page 22, note 17, salaries and benefits disclosure. Again, this is is required disclosure for all municipalities and para-municipal entities. Just want to make sure there is transparency with respect to what people are receiving in terms of salary and benefits. So that's note 17 on page 22. Page 23 just breaks down your debt limits. Again, this is a required disclosure under public sector accounting. You've obviously, most important thing there to note is you do have some debt servicing limit that is unused. So you, again, what that's indicating is based on the numbers as they're currently calculated. It appears you could take on more debt if required. So it's always good to have that additional ability if the need arises. Notes 19 and 20 are just note disclosures with respect to contingencies and commitments. I think those are pretty standard. You got some forward contract there for some electricity, and then you've got some projects that you have committed to complete over the next few years. We can skip segmented information on page 24, the budget on 25. And then schedules 1 and 2 at the back of your statements, again, are just a breakdown of the revenue and expenses by the major departments within the town. So, are there any questions on the statements?
Jay?
Thank you, Your Worship. A few questions, if you don't mind.
Sure, no? Go ahead.
They're not in any particular order. Gotta go back to where I started. So let's, if we can, I think my first note, I mean, obviously, what I want to say first off is congratulations to Barb and her team again. I mean, having read through the financial statements, we received the draft ones in terms of the report to council, and the no significant findings of any kind is always very reassuring to hear that appropriate and exemplary management of the money is happening. Just for my own edification, because I think this will be the 7th time I've asked this question or something similar to it, and it's not sinking in. It's not anybody's fault. It's just something I'm not getting. If we can look at page 5 and the consolidated statement of operations. And Tom, you can tell me I'm wrong or back me up because you've been around a long time, and everybody around the table can do the same for the budget 2018. When I look at the excess of revenues over expenditures before capital revenues are involved, and the budget for 2018 shows a deficit of $844,961. This has happened several times in the years that I've served, and what I can assure you is that we have never knowingly passed an operational deficit budget. Is that what it is?
That, the deficit was passed in the utilities budget. So
Ah.
tax supported is always balanced.
It's always balanced.
Yes.
And
utility
utilities-
supported was in a deficit position.
And has been for quite a
Yes.
while, and will be until we get to total cost recovery.
Correct.
See, I know there's an answer. I know it makes sense. It's just that when confronted with a number in parentheses about what I know that we've never passed a deficit operating budget on the tax supported side. It's the utility supported side that drags that number down. Excellent. Thank you for the clarification.
It's essentially a presentation. The answer is presentation.
Gotcha. Page 21, number 16, LAPP. The numbers changed from 2017 to 2018 where the employer contributions went up and employee contributions declined by $58,000. What would cause that to happen? Where our portion went up and the employee portion went down by a good chunk?
How much difference is it?
58 grand.
You're up here, but you're down here.
do know that we had to buy some prior year service back. So the employees portion would not show. And otherwise, I would have to go look. It might be differences in some of the positions, salary ranges have changed over year.
Yeah, so the increase in our contributions of the buyback, that makes sense. So yeah, that's what I was thinking, Barb, is that the employee contribution would be very, very different if we had a long-term employee leave and the new person starting off at a much lower salary. That would make sense. But to the tune of $58,000, that's what I just wanted to ask and clarify.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can double check on that though. Sorry, what note 16, right?
Page 22, number 17, salaries and benefits disclosure. So for the year of 2018, we were all elected for the whole year. So I always got to ask, because I don't get it. If I managed to win the race that year, and when it's differences on benefits and allowances, I get that, because some of us are enrolled in the benefits plan as families, some as singles, some have not elected to have the full meal deal, et cetera, so I get that. Would the difference among us on salary be a reflection of per diems requested and paid? Yeah?
Yes,
Okay.
I would say yes.
So that would be the difference there, just for clarification. Thank you. On page 23, item 18, the debenture debt limits. I'm certain it struck everyone. It's always a good indication, but I'd like to draw council's attention again. This is the actual, here we have it staring us right in the face, everyone, and something to consider for a number of years going forward, certainly the remainder of this term. With the total, if we added another when we add another $5 million to our total debt, that reduces what we're able to borrow still by a quarter. And I'm almost certain that there's a council policy on the books that wouldn't let us get anywhere close to the $30 million we could borrow. So we may need to revisit that once that number for 2019 includes an additional 5. Again, that money might be phased over the next 10 years that we anticipate the entire amount of flood mitigation taking, but it doesn't change the fact that if the council policy is actually at 20 million and we're going to push over the 14 to 15 million mark with flood mitigation, that information has to inform every decision we make for a number of years on future borrowing. And I believe that's the end of my comments and questions.
You're correct, I do see, these calculations are again according to, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, guys. The calculations, again, are according to the MGA, but I do see in my experiences with other towns and municipalities that they'll set their own internal limits. So they're building in a significant buffer. The limit might be 35 million, but they'll pass a resolution that says thou shalt not exceed
Right.
this level.
And I can't remember what the
So-
council policy says at the time, but 60% of the 30 million that we're eligible for? So 18?
So that's
19?
that's quite common.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Either way, adding another 5 over the next few years puts a serious dent in that number. That's it for me. Thank you very much. Again, way to go, Barb.
Tom?
Yeah, so I ask this question about every 7 years. You do many of these for many municipalities.
Yep.
So anything that stands out for you that we are doing very well? Anything that stands out that we are doing not very well? Anything that we could do better, that we could steal from some other municipality?
Again, just to reiterate, and I've got a little trend analysis that I can share with you here. It's a 1,000-foot view of sort of where the town is at. I don't know if Barb can throw that up there. And maybe this helps answer your question, but when I throw where your financial results and your the strength of your balance sheet on a trend analysis, you can see where I think this tells a pretty important story. So this is your balance sheet, and we talked about your net financial asset position, which again is a ratio, and I've shown you the ratio there of assets to liabilities. You can see that ratio's been steadily increasing. So that means your financial assets are getting, relative to the growth in liabilities, is getting stronger. So your net financial asset position, as you can see, in 2013, you were actually in a net financial debt position of 1.5 million. You're now at 13.3 million positive. That's a significant turnaround in 5 years. So that's a trend. That, to me, is a very positive trend. And then, again, you can see there were some fairly large, like 2014 was a significant turnaround year.
What year did I join the town?
I think that's the year Barb joined, yeah. So, what a coincidence. So, 2014 was a big turnaround year, and then, again, you can see every year it's been 13%. 2016 was still positive at 2.8%. Last year, significant at 15.7%, and then your change this year of 7.4%. So, again, that trend to me signals that you're doing a number of things right from an asset and liability management standpoint. And then if we look at the accumulated surplus, which is the next tab, again, this is 1,000-foot view, but again, you can see this focuses in on your statement of operations and just says, sort of where you're at compared to now. Your budget this year was, I don't want to say it was off, but you budgeted for significant capital revenues, which you didn't end up actually experiencing. But again, the important thing in here is that accumulated surplus number is trending upward. So that's the important thing that I like to see. Again, this year you ran a $3 million net annual surplus. If I can just, that number's right. Yep, 3 million all in. Last year 2.4, 16 1.5. So again, you've strung together a number of surpluses, which is good. And obviously, when you can have an operating surplus and a net surplus in the same year, that's even more positive. And this year you had, for example, just over $1 million in operating surplus compared to 325 loss last year. That wasn't a significant loss last year, but you've basically, looks like you're starting to eliminate operating losses. So again, when I see those types of numbers, I surely don't get nervous. It's not a requirement for a tough discussion or anything like that. So compared to what I see out there, this is very strong financial performance. And in light of, I wouldn't say we're in the strongest economy in the world. So I would say under those circumstances, I think the town's on a solid footing. Comparing the town to larger, a mid-sized city, again, the factors are so different. The ability to generate revenue from lot sales and development it's hard to compare the circumstances of rural Alberta to sort of those mid-sized cities. But you're doing very well for a moderately sized rural town.
Sorry, I was just trying to answer the LAPP question. I just was looking to see if that LAPP question would have something to do with the rate contribution. So it's percentage. Okay.
So just the other document I wanted to quickly touch on, it sounds like you've had a chance.
Can I just ask a
Yeah,
question on this
sure.
other one? So, on that capital revenue projection, that was just kind of hoping we were selling lots? Is that what that was about? Just curious how you come up with that number. Just on the screen there, the 10 million.
Are you talking about the capital revenue budgeted number?
yeah.
Why it was so high?
But is that was just kind of projection of sale of lots, and that was that?
No, that, Barb, do you want to answer that, or?
Sorry, that would have been our 2018 capital budget, which we had quite a bit of flood mitigation work expected, plus any of, and we didn't do the ARCP grant.
Okay, perfect. And just curious, so for our viewing listeners, I mean, we're talking some numbers and that kind of thing. So how do we explain to them that these funds are set aside for future road, future infrastructure, future, just because if they see a surplus, they're going to ask, well, where's the break in the taxes? So I just want some clarity on, so we can explain that to the people.
Yeah, go ahead and I'll add some
I don't know
comments.
how good I'll explain. So essentially, the reserves are just kind of like having a piggy bank for replacement and repair of all the capital assets that we have. So unlike at home, when you have a vehicle, a brand new vehicle, you're going to need to replace that in 10 years, and it would be the best to be able to put 1/10 of the future cost of that vehicle aside every year, so when it comes time, you can pay cash. Similarly, the reserves are set aside for replacement or repair, future replacement of our assets. So if we didn't put that money aside every year when it comes time to build a new arena or put a new water main in the ground, we wouldn't have that little piggy bank of funding aside to pay for that. And then in those years, the mill rate, for example, we fund large and abnormal maintenance items out of reserve. So when it costs $250,000 to repair or replace the arena roof this year, for example, if we had to fund that out of the mill rate, if 1% is 85,000 or so, we would have to jack the mill rate considerably. So we set some money aside in reserves when we have to do those big jobs. Then it doesn't impact the mill rate that year and the taxes for that year. I hope.
Is it also fair to add, Barb, that in relation to the accumulated surplus, though, that certainly a portion of that would be from operational efficiencies, money not spent, that sort of thing. But the overwhelming majority of it is actually the cash reflection of the annual amortization or the amount shifted to those reserves every year from amortizing that happens in the operating budget. So saying that we have this much accumulated surplus annually means this is how much we plan to put away into those piggy banks this year. It is not money available. It is certainly at council's discretion to choose that, but we've been on a plan of trying to fund those reserves because the long-term, our capital financing strategy clearly demands it because, again, our reserves are better than some, but still nowhere near our ultimate goals for what they should look like 10, 15 years down the road. Is that
Correct.
fair?
And if I could just add to that, yes, absolutely. And actually, our reserves, our amortization is based on cost at the time, and we know that we're going to be paying into the future cost as well. So our amortization rate, while it's, at the right rate according to GAAP, but it's severely under funding if we stayed at that rate. So absolutely.
Okay, I appreciate that, because it's,
And
you got
if-
something else to add on that?
Sure, I'll add just
Okay.
a little bit. If you sort of do a little bit more of a micro-analysis of your operating surplus, because that's the number I would look at versus the 3 million. The capital revenue, I would say you have slightly less control over the capital revenue number than you do over the operating number. And that operating number is a positive 1 million, but if you actually look at the revenue and expenses for the year, you actually lowered your expenses by about 800,000. And when you look at the composition of the revenues for the year, municipal taxes were only up about 240,000. But where you gained some, if you want to call it a small windfall, was on sales and user fees, franchises, and concessions. And I wouldn't exactly call those predictable revenue streams. So when you look at the composition of those revenues, I wouldn't say there's a lot of pressure to reduce taxes. I think you had some windfalls in a couple of areas for revenues, controlled your expenses, and the $1 million surplus you have is fairly easily explainable. When I look at the statements, I don't see that $1 million surplus coming from a significant increase in taxes. Yeah.
And if I could, sorry, just mention too, at least a quarter of the $1 million was an adjustment to our amortization expense, which I had previously mentioned.
Okay, no, that's just good clarity for all of us so that, we're just trying to make the town just very sustainable. And this is just good information, so thanks so much. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for all that and appreciate, you're going to do the next one,
Well,
sorry.
I'm going to keep it fairly, because I think everybody had a chance to look at the report to council. That's again a required communication, and I hope you've had a chance to read through it. Just a couple of really high-level comments. Again, I think obviously from looking at the adjustments that were made during the audit and the items that we post to what's called our summary of unadjusted differences, that you see it was a very clean audit. And actually, we ended up removing another adjustment from the SLAM schedule. I'm not sure if you got that updated one, but so even reflects a cleaner audit than we had originally presented in the first draft. So again, very clean audit. Again, we get a lot. It's obvious when we're going through the audit that management is not in the sort of mode of just doing what you did last year. We see areas that are cleaned up in the general ledger, things are improved, controls are tightened up. So that's always good to see that improvement. And that they have the time to tackle some areas of the operations and clean them up. So it's always great to see that. We didn't have any management letter points, so there's no major internal control deficiencies or areas that we think could be significantly improved. Again, we saw some improvement in some areas of just general ledger cleanup and account cleanup. So those are, it's good to see those. So again, overall, a very clean audit from our perspective.
All right, any other? Go ahead, Jay.
Do you have a tape recorder going, Barb, to be replayed at your next evaluation? Yeah. Well done.
Well, thank you. Appreciate you taking the time for us, and
That's all I have, and yeah, thanks for having me. And if anybody on council has any questions that pop up after I leave, Barb knows where to find me. Just you're welcome to send those questions along. I'm glad to answer them.
Christine?
Sorry, just a quick question that came to me here. So going back to our reserves, I know I've heard it mentioned numerous times that we're nowhere near where we should be. Is there do you know how off we are?
The determination of reserves is as much an art as it is a science. And there's so many factors that go into, determining what makes a reserve appropriate, sufficient. And my response is that it's hard for me to comment whether those reserves are sufficient. There are methods out there that you can, cash flow analysis and things like that, where we can drill down a little bit more into the factors to see if the reserve is where it should be. We do some of that work, but if you were to compare these reserves against another town or municipalities, I think you'd find quite the variation. Again, you need to drill down into the underlying facts to know why one particular municipality has 20 million in a reserve, and you've got a same or similar title to your reserve, and it's only 5 million. So it's an area of significant judgment in municipal financial statements.
If I could, just to clarify, back when the world was young and so was I, they were throwing around rules of thumb that about 30% of your tangible capital assets is a reasonable reserve figure to strive for. And I know that, again, we are healthy compared to most, in fact, ahead of the curve compared to most. But if that was true, you guys are, and we were moving, still we got to be happy about moving from 15.4 to 18.7 million in just 1 year's time. That would be $71 million if we were to have 30% of our tangible capital assets put aside. And so that's quite a gap, right? But it's one of those things where we just do the best we can with trying to amortize 100%. I do not believe we've ever been able to reach that actual goal, especially on the utilities side.
Not in our budget, but we do. Sorry. We don't in our budget fully amortize except in utilities, but our operating statements this year we did fully cover through operations. Last year we fully funded except for 300 and some odd thousand, which was the operating loss last year. I think it was 300 and something, yeah. So we're getting there.
Right, but is that still, I mean, I realize it's so difficult, like you said, it's more art than science, but is it still written down somewhere that 30% of tangible capital assets is a reasonable figure?
I have seen that. I've never seen anybody
Actually get there?
get there.
That's fair, yeah.
Specific percentage. I think it's more of a pie in the sky sort of.
Okay,
But it's obviously something to strive for.
it's good to have goals.
So I wouldn't discourage you from going in that direction.
But even if we were to get halfway there, folks, right, even if we were to go with 15%, we're talking about going from 18 million to 36 million, right?
Yeah, building those reserves is a very fiscally prudent thing to do. So you won't get anybody criticizing you for that course of action. Okay, that's all I have. Again, thanks for having me, and we appreciate the business. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right.
Do we need to make a motion to accept the audited financial statements as presented?
That was just what we were discussing.
Then I'd be happy to make that motion.
So
Your
you
Worship.
go ahead.
I'd like to move that we accept our audited financial statements for fiscal year 2018 as presented.
Tom, second. Comments? All in favor? Carried. Okay, let's just take a 5-minute break. All right, are we almost ready to, Linda, are we close? We're on. Okay, let's get moving. Let's move down to 6.1.3. Daryl?
Okay. Thank you, Your Worship. So you have before you a request for decision on a community assistance application for the Drumheller Community Learning Society, the Homework Help Program. So as council did a couple years ago with the community assistance policy, anything over $5,000 comes before council. So community groups make an application to the town, need to provide some information around financials, the actual request. So in this case, the Drumheller Community Assistance Community Learning Society is asking for $7,000 for their homework help program. So they have provided this information. They provided all the required information. Now this was one of those requests that actually came forward late last year after they had made a presentation to council, and to be honest, I think everyone overlooked it as part of the 2019 budget preparation piece. So as stated, council's approved $30,000 for community assistance in kind in the operating budget, and we're recommending that council reallocate a portion of the in-kind community assistance to cash donation for this application.
Motion, please. Tony?
I think we'll have to be explicit here. What exactly what the motion has to say.
Well, if we just get a motion on the
I'll be
floor, then
willing
we
to
can
make a motion,
discuss
Your
for
Worship.
sure.
I move that council funds the community assistance application of the Drumheller Learning Society to the amount of $7,000.
Seconder? Tony, comments? Tony?
Very good program. Hats off to the people that support this and the volunteers that are involved in the program. Good thing or not, you know, they're supporting up to 79 students here from grades elementary to high school. That's a lot of kids needing a lot of help. Community funding has been touch and go, I think, since Synovus left. Torxon stepped in, but still, you know, there's some participation obviously here from County Wheatland, Starland would have some of these students here as well in this program through the high school.
They may have, however, I don't know if there's any support from them or not. I can't speak to that.
Okay. And the other thing is, you know, it is at this point a free no charge homework assistance. And I'd support the funding, but I would think that some consideration should be given to the user. I know if I had sent my child there for some support, I would kind of expect to pay. There are going to be hardship cases, and they can deal with that on their own, but I think part of it has to come from a local funding as well. But I'd support the 7.
Tom?
Yeah, I support this as well. I would, however, like to mention, I very much appreciate the quality of this application. And I guess I'm just reaching out to other groups and interests that are thinking of maybe applying for the community assistance program, that this type of a thorough application is very much appreciated. And I would suggest to other groups that they get their applications in as soon as possible if they are thinking of that.
Fred?
Maybe there's somebody on council can steer me in the right direction. I'm not good at financial statements. Where are the offsetting expenses here for the operating money? I don't see it. I don't understand.
Jay?
Thank you, Your Worship. I have my own comments I'd like to make, but I am able to answer Councillor Makawicki's question, I think. You're right, Fred. as much as Councillor Zarisky is correct in that it's a good application, they made a mistake in providing the financial statement for the 2.5, almost 3 month period where they don't operate. This is showing July, August, and September when the program really gets rolling in October, which is when they have the vast majority of their expenses, and forward, of course, as their largest expense is paying for the tutors, the actual people delivering the tutoring assistance. So why on earth this was included instead of the annuals, I don't know. But what I can tell you is that certainly the annual expenditures would equal the annual revenue. This is not a program that's able to run any kind of surplus at any point. Does that answer your question?
It answers it to the point, but I really can't,
Yeah.
I can't spend taxpayers' money without the whole picture, and giving me July and August and not showing me where the deficit is not something, I mean, I support it. I really worked hard for Luis to find alternate funding, and I'm behind this. However, until I have the numbers in front of me, I'm unable to move ahead and say, yes, we need to commit to this. I need to see the numbers that offset the revenue.
Anybody else? Jay?
Thank you, Your Worship. I understand. I would argue only that it's an administrative oversight, and as sitting on their board for the last, however year and a bit that I was appointed to serve as council's representative, I have no difficulty in saying that I can confidently express that there are expense offsets over the course of the year, or rather the 9 months that the program operates. It just is difficult for the whole organization because it's one program out of many and operates, as I mentioned, not the full year. So when we go down as a board to sit and look at the financial statements on a monthly basis, we're all satisfied with the accounting of the organization. Whether or not the staff always has the best handle on what information to bring forward, that's a different story. What I will say is that the Torkson grant that you worked so hard to help them get was meant to help offset expenses in the 2018-2019 year. So again, the program operates in the school year, so it blends over calendar years, and that the 2019-2020 year is what's in question. Because I needed to double check for myself, because of course it would appear as though if you looked at the entire expenditures over 2018-2019 as though the program's fully funded. That's not accurate because they're really asking for support for the 2019 and 2020. What I will say is that I also am a huge fan of the program. My family also has benefited from it. And two of my children, both of my children have been the recipients of tutoring. I think in the history of the program, it has always tried to provide the support at no cost to the user. But you're right, there was funding, Tony, for a number of years that was provided through a corporation who has simply not the resources to do this any longer. I would be comfortable providing this level of funding so long as the message is sent explicitly that this was meant to be transitional, to help them bridge a gap year where they solve the problem but still have not lined up sustainable funding. And my rationale for that is that it's jurisdictional. Primary education and even secondary education is not the jurisdiction of municipal councils. It is without question 100% responsibility of the provincial government. And whenever we accept offloading, because of course we're talking about people requiring additional instructional hours who are still going to high school and junior high school and some elementary, I understand, that this is absolutely something that should be being funded by Alberta Education and is not. But we have two choices. We can howl against the wind about the fact that the province has offloaded this responsibility in perpetuity and certainly try our best to lobby against it, or we can solve the problem, which is provide the funding so the people in our community get the help that they need. But I am torn because anytime we're asked to step outside our jurisdiction, I have to feel as though we've really got our own backyard completely in order before we spend money on somebody else's backyard. And I don't always feel like that. So I would be comfortable in providing what they're requested, but I would also like to suggest to council that in relatively short order, perhaps given how things work in an organization this large, really just for budget 2020, that we revisit the total amount of funding allocated to the community assistance program in the first place. We're talking about one application taking up to almost a third of the allocated funding. And that's a serious chunk out of it gone. So their board's aware, their staff are aware that my feeling was, that I made clear around the board table, that requests for sustained funding would be something that I could not support and champion, but that support for a transitional period of time, hopefully just this 1 year, would certainly be something that I would be happy to champion at the council table. So I'm comfortable with the motion as it stands.
Christine?
So, yes, I agree with that, Jay, totally. And you bring up a really good point. This funding was, sorry, just so I'm clear, 2019, correct? Is what this is really for, is next year. So,
Well, so next school year, they can
Next
make
school
it
year.
till the end of this school year, of course, which is just a couple of months away, but then they would be without adequate funding for September through to the next June. Yes.
okay. So where I really like your point is where you say this eats up like a third of our allotted amount here. So because there is a period of time where they could possibly find other resources, is there a possibility that we could look at giving them a smaller amount than what they asked?
Jay?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just to address that issue, you're absolutely right in that council has the ability to vary any amount that we deem is appropriate. It's the size of the ask that made it come from admin up to council in the first place. So we certainly are within our prerogative to do so. I can't remember the first point that you asked about. What was the clarification?
Well,
you
I'm
used?
just wondering whether, because there is a bit of time until this money is needed the next school year, that if they could
okay.
find other funding
Right.
so that we don't give it all,
Thank you.
just to eat up the whole
So
thing.
I do want to make sure that council remembers, and I'm sure it was mentioned in their application, that the society, Drumheller Community Learning Society, is actually it has already established a standalone fundraising body, terms of reference accepted by the province, but is still in its infancy. And as everyone's probably aware on the table, while there are other avenues available, access to gaming money takes years. And so the likelihood that the foundation, the fundraising body that's been established, is going to be able to meet this goal, in the next 12 months, is certainly lofty and something that I know that they're working towards. But the likelihood that before the end of calendar 2019, that they'd be able to raise the amount that's being requested, I'm not sure that's realistic, but they certainly are moving forward. And that's why I think the society is prepared to try to move towards their own sustainability by doing more of their own active fundraising through the standalone body. But I'm not sure it's realistic to expect that it would be successful in doing so by the end of this year.
So one thing that, the reason I was thinking not just necessarily relying on gaming is I do know that they came forward to the Library Society. And that society actually did contribute money toward these guys. So I don't know if there's any other societies out there, the more that we talk about this and get this out there, maybe they would be willing to come forward and say, okay, yeah, council maybe can't give that full amount, but we would be willing, like whether it's Rotary or anybody that would be willing to contribute, possibly.
Fred?
Jay, you completely justified why it is we have members on committees. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. I do have a question, however. Have you got any idea whether Torkson will be in for his second year?
No, I don't, Fred. Just as a matter of comedy of errors, I haven't actually been able to attend the last 2 consecutive meetings, and other than that, my attendance has been exemplary. And so I don't know. I didn't have a chance to ask that question. What I do know is that when it was received, it was received as there was no expectation about future gifts, from what I understand, in terms of a formal agreement. But at the same time, the fundraising body is going to spare no time in trying to unearth any potential other donors, and of course would be going back to someone who had been as generous as Torkson had been in the last year. So I think one of the things they're trying to do is to make sure that they're asking as many sources as possible, and if in the result that they wind up with more money than is required to operate for a year, then I think it would be one of the first times in that organization's history that they would then run a surplus, which would be used to operate the next year, and so on and so on. Yeah. At the same time, though, I think the only way it could survive in the absence of those fundraised dollars would be to do exactly what Tony had mentioned, and I think the organization is, given the, I think Fred and I might stand out as different demographics in terms of who's accessing the program. I think they're loath to try to implement user fees. I think they would really only do that as a last resort.
I'm not sure. I just have a comment on that. I have wrote letters to the Minister of Education on a couple other issues, and I was wondering if Louise and Dana would put something together to explain why is this happening, like what's happening in our school system that we have to, as a municipality, have a homework. So I really like if they could put something together that would really help the cause, and I will definitely take that to the new minister, because meetings are going to be set up ASAP with quite a few of them. So, all right. Okay, so any other comments on that? So are we all in favor?
So, sorry, I was just going to add a comment, and maybe this is an amendment, friendly amendment, but to Christine's point about sort of needing it over a 2-year period. So from our standpoint, 2 fiscal years, so 19 and 20, council could say that they would dedicate some of the money to half the money, which would operate from September to December, which then we would be able to consider the remainder in our 2020 budget deliberations, which taxes this amount less than the $7,500 ask.
I would agree with that.
Fred?
Daryl, I mean, this and the next ask, I know we had presentations, but I know we had a number of other presentations as well. Are there any more of these that are going to come forward?
No, these were, so the next one did not do a presentation. This one did do a presentation, but the other ones were all, any of the presentations and asks were already approved as part of council deliberations.
Okay, so who made the motion? If they want to amend it, or are we leaving it stand as is?
I made the motion, Your Worship. Politically, I can reject the friendly amendment, and then it's an up or down vote on the $7,000. And if council felt that they wanted to bridge that funding over 2 fiscal years, then a separate motion would have to be made after it was denied, after it was, if the vote was against that motion. And I'm going to let it ride. I'm going to see if the motion passes as is. I reject the friendly amendment request.
All right, any more comments? Let's hear the motion.
The motion was for council to fund the request, fund the community facility, what is it again? Community Assistance Program request, application for the Drumheller Community Learning Society in the amount of $7,000.
Okay, all in favor? Opposed? please note. All right, thank you. You're on again, Daryl.
All right, the next one before you was is a community assistance application for Hope College. So normally Hope College comes before council to do a presentation. They did not this year, and this was submitted to us on April the 4th, so after the council passed the budget in March. But basically what they're looking for is $7,500, a $7,500 contribution for their continued operations. So you can see from the past years, the last 17 and 18, council funded $7,500 each year. The prior years to that, they were lower amounts. So this would be the exact same thought process as far as recommending that some of the in-kind contribution be converted to a cash donation for Badlands or Community College / Hope College.
I get a motion? Nobody wants to make a motion? Okay. That motion will not come forward. All right, you're on again, Daryl.
Right, thank you. So a request for decision for the award of a contract for community counseling. So I apologize that originally this RFD was just set up to be approved by the CAO, but so the actual motion will change from the recommendation. As we know, anything that involves tying up or encumbering future dollars or future year dollars needs to come before council for approval. So Wheatland Community Counseling was the only bidder for the work of community counseling in the area. They were within the approved budget that council had set, $25,000 a year for 3 years worth of counseling. And what we're recommending is that council approve the contract for Wheatland County Counseling for the period ending December 31st, 2021.
Motion, Tom?
So moved.
Second, Fred, comments? Fred?
I'm extremely proud to support this counseling effort. I know that our departments here within the town, April, has done a good job selling it to us. I've had a lot of communication with people that have taken advantage of the program last year, and we're begging for the program to continue, that they had no means to continue on their own. So I'm really happy and feel that it's been a productive program and a good, a positive program for our community.
Anybody else? All in favor? Carried. All right, can I please get a motion to go in camera? Land matter, 2 land matters, labor matter. Christine, Tom, all in favor? Carried.